Ahoy! Finding the right weapon can be challenging as a new player or even a returning player in New World. In this video, I'd like to talk about the, in my opinion, best and worst weapons for leveling specifically. Not for late game, not for PvP, just for leveling. Of course, this is all subjective, this is just my opinion, and there is no weapon that is inherently completely bad for anything in the game, but this is just a solid overview, I'm hoping, of what I would recommend if you're starting out and if you want to have an easy time leveling. So we're going to start with a weapon that I think summarizes things pretty well in terms of what you want from a leveling weapon. The Fire Staff has strong single target damage, it has strong AoE damage, and it has a ranged component. You can attack from range, meaning it's very easy to pull mobs and get the credit for mobs through that. So anything you are looking for on this list otherwise is kind of compared to this high tier here, the S tier, and the Fire Staff, I think, is one of the front runners here. The only thing it's really lacking is CC and sustain, but with the Fire Staff, enemies are often dead before they even get to you, so sustain may not be an issue. A bit of a weak point is also that it doesn't pair that well with other strong leveling weapons because it's an int weapon, but it's still very much fine on its own. Another weapon that used to be at the head of S tier at some point is the Hatchet. I think the Hatchet is still a very good leveling weapon, but I don't think it is the strict best anymore like it used to be. A big part of that was that it used to self-heal, and the self-heal was extremely effective. You just press a button and you have a consistent self-heal. And at the time, it took quite a while to regenerate health. So for that reason, the Hatchet was extremely good. That effect is no longer on the Hatchet, it has lifesteal instead now, so you need to be actively engaging in a fight to get this effect. And that makes it a little bit weaker. On the other hand, there are still quite a few strengths to the Hatchet. The Hatchet gets more damage the more enemies are around you, and has very high single target damage by itself already. It also is immune to staggers, which can just remove annoyance in any farm, though staggers in PvE have been greatly reduced. It also scales with strength and dexterity, which makes it very good in terms of combining it with other weapons that are fairly good for leveling. Also, it has a ranged attack or multiple range attacks, you can choose whichever you want, which means even though this is a melee weapon, you can ranged pull. This makes it a very, very good secondary weapon if you choose another strength or dex weapon as your primary, and that weapon doesn't happen to have a ranged attack because you get the extra tool of pulling, which is going to be pretty nice in the early days when people will be pulling mobs away left and right with their ranged weapons. Next up, we can look at the Spear, which I think is also a very solid S tier weapon. The Spear combines well with the Hatchet, and it also comes with a lot of bleeds, it comes with weakens on the enemy, it comes with fortifies to yourself and all that, and it can lock mobs down very nicely with a bunch of CC that you can use for that, a bunch of crowd control, stuns, sweeps that knock the enemy on the ground and whatnot. It technically also has a ranged attack if you want to with a Javelin, though most people don't tend to use that for leveling since there are generally better abilities on the weapon for that purpose. So I think the Spear is definitely one of the best weapons in that regard as well. And then another weapon that I would put in this tier is the Greatsword. The Greatsword is just extremely good at both single target damage, but also at AoE clearing multiple enemies around you. It comes with pretty decent defensive utility if you want to spec it that way, which also gives you some self-heal, some survivability and whatnot. So you actually sustain quite nicely while you're being relatively aggressive and high damaging otherwise, something that the other weapons here don't really offer to the same extent. It scales with the same attributes as both of these weapons here, both the Hatchet and the Spear, strength and dexterity. It scales equally with them, so you can really choose here. So all around, just a very nice all-rounder weapon that also scales very well into late game PvE especially, but even in PvP I would argue it scales decently. So good choice. So these are the main S tier weapons that I'd be looking at primarily when it comes to leveling at the moment, but there are most certainly other choices worth considering. If you're enjoying the video so far and you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and click the bell. I will be making in-depth breakdowns for all the melee weapons here when it comes to how to level with them, what the builds for leveling are. So if you're interested in that, definitely make sure to stick around for that. That's coming over the next days. Now let's move on to A tier. I think a weapon that definitely belongs into A tier, it's a bit situational how exactly you want to place it here, but generally is the Life Staff. The Life Staff just provides you with insane sustain while you're leveling. You don't ever need to worry about health basically, because you can just constantly heal up, and it makes a lot of situations a lot easier. At the same time, it doesn't have the highest damage, or AoE damage especially, so obviously it's a bit slower at clearing mobs, so you need to combine it with something else that does that job for you. But there are options that you can use, so I do think it's a very nice choice. Alongside that, if you're intending to run any dungeons while you're leveling, you have a much easier time finding a party for that, because they are going to be looking for healers. So I think the Life Staff is nice. It would be even nicer, I would put it into S tier, if it was easier to put focus gems in your secondary weapon all the time, so that scales with focus as well, and you could just spec into focus. The problem is that along your journey you might not find enough focus gems with how often you may be switching weapons, so that's more something that you want to consider at higher levels, close to level 65 pretty much. Another weapon that kind of has a similar argument to be in A tier, I would say, is the sword, or more specifically the sword and shield. Once again, a weapon that scales with strength and dexterity, which makes it very nice with all of these three up here. And generally a little bit less utility or lockdown than some of them in some situations. For example, I would say a spear is a bit better at killing a single mob, but comes with some decent AoE damage. Also recently got a ability overhaul essentially, so that one upheaval might be a bit more interesting now for leveling, and is also, along with that, just the option that you want to get if you want to get into tanking early on. You can, for example, also tank with a Greatsword, but I think that the majority of people that are new, at least, that are looking for a tank, will be looking for someone with sword and shield, and it's easy enough to just respec into a tank build for an expedition to quickly switch over and be their tank, and you will find a group probably even easier than someone with a Life Staff. So overall a fantastic choice, and again, generally also good for mob clear. Maybe not the best choice, but definitely a solid one in many situations. Now we get to the Great Axe. I think the Great Axe can be argued as an A tier weapon. Comes with a little bit of self-sustain, a lot of AoE. It doesn't exactly have a ranged attack, but it has a semi-ranged pull with Reap, so if an enemy is somewhat close, you can kind of pull them towards you. And just, it depends a lot on how you build the weapon compared to others. So I can either say a lot of single target damage if you're going left tree with Execute, or a lot of AoE damage if you're going into the right tree. But either way, there are pathways to make this decently effective for leveling at least. Also helps that you have very, very high mobility with a charge. Something that, for example, you have on the Fire Staff, you have to a lesser extent on the Greatsword, and you have it on the sword. But the charge is a very easy way to get from mob to mob and just consistently keep farming mobs, which makes a lot of quests that require you to kill mobs much quicker. And also it allows you to move around the world quicker, which is something that you can, for example, get with a Hatchet as well. You get a movement speed buff there. But other than that, most other weapons are not quite as good at giving you that extra mobility. The Hatchet, for example, kind of gets outclassed now by having access to a mount, whereas the charge from the Great Axe is something you can use before you get on your mount. So I think this is still very, very beneficial. Next, there's the Rapier. The Rapier, in my opinion, is a fantastic weapon for high-level PvE, especially if you're trying to solo mobs, just the best choice. However, it's not quite as great for leveling, as it doesn't really fully come online until you're quite a fair bit down the skill tree already. So you need to kind of level slower to then be able to level faster, eventually maybe. And it also is very heavily dependent on one specific perk that you want to have either on your weapon or armor, which is Leeching Flurry, in order to get extra sustain. And being that dependent on a perk is a bit annoying when you're in the leveling process where you're often changing gear. It's definitely good. It has very, very high single target damage. Not the best at AoE, but again, it has very strong self-sustain when you have the right perk for it. And once you have the skill tree far enough that you can have Flourish and Finish, you can pop an insane amount of damage on enemies. Problem is, some enemies will already be almost dead by the time you get to that, so you may want to opt for a right skill tree build instead, which is not quite as good at early PvE, in my opinion, evade build. So something that becomes a little more effective a little bit later, and also becomes a little bit more effective once you learn how to use it effectively. Maybe not the best beginner weapon starting out. So yeah, I really liked this once I was max level and picked it up at max level. Before that it didn't feel quite as great, but still definitely a solid choice. I'm going to put the bow here as well. Bow can be combined with Rapier, for example, because it scales with dexterity. The fact that it is ranged means you can pull mobs very easily. It has very good damage, especially single target, and it provides you with some extra mobility for running around. Again, not that great anymore since we have mounts now, but it can be nice if you're just hopping from mob to mob, basically. I do think that in the early days, when there's a lot of players around the same zones competing for the same mobs, the bow is basically even better. It goes up to S tier, but when we look at what it does later on against mobs, I would say Fire Staff is a little bit nicer, because it also has the burnout, the mobility. But close enough to each other anyways that I would say the bow is a very, very effective weapon. So all of the weapons you're seeing here are very effective weapons for leveling with different strength and weaknesses. But even with the bow, for example, you can get quite a solid amount of AoE damage as well, so that helps a lot. And that brings us to slightly weaker weapons, but only really slightly. On one hand, we have the Ice Gauntlet here, also a ranged weapon, which is beneficial, but doesn't have quite as much damage that you can reliably, quickly utilize, because it is partially a utility weapon. But you can still very easily combine it with a Fire Staff, and then you just use Ice Storm and Ice Spike on here, and you get even more damage out of that. So it's absolutely still a very strong weapon choice. It has good single target damage, not the best, but it's okay. It has good AoE damage, and it has good mob control, which can be nice in some situations. It lacks a bit of extra mobility or other flashy things, but it also has a nice free get out of jail card in form of Entomb, so if you're ever at risk while leveling, this is also a great option for that. And while we're looking at gauntlets, we're also going to look at the Void Gauntlet. I'm going to put that right here as well. It could be argued that maybe the Void Gauntlet is even an A tier weapon. It's very nice with Void Blade being a melee option that works against multiple targets, but then you're also having ranged attacks for the opposite. So it's not necessarily as bursty as the Fire Staff, but it has a lot of interesting utility that comes along with it. And if you're combining it with a Life Staff, that's basically your best combination for the Life Staff for leveling, because it partially scales with focus, and you can put some points into intelligence because of the way it scales with focus, but that just gives you all-around benefits between those two weapons, and I think that is going to be very, very nice. So definitely an option that is worth keeping in mind for Life Staff builds specifically, and also otherwise a pretty solid choice for certain intelligence builds. Going to put the Warhammer here as well. This may be a little bit controversial, because similar to the Spear, in late game, the Warhammer is one of the best weapons for soloing bosses especially. But the problem with the Warhammer is that it doesn't really reach full effectiveness until you have quite a few perks, and for those soloing ideas that you may have for later, you can't effectively do those until you have certain perks. Like, for example, you want to have Transient Recovery on your Warhammer, and not every Warhammer that you get early on is going to have Transient Recovery, and other things along those lines. So it's very nice for AoE clearing. It's pretty good single target damage still. It's surprising if you go into the left tree, but there are certain other weapons that outcompete it in terms of what they have as additional benefits, in my opinion. But again, we're talking BT here. These are very good weapons. All of these can perfectly be used for leveling. And now we get to the weapons that I think are a bit more difficult to place. So the Musket, once upon a time, used to be D tier because it just didn't have enough to offer for PvE in general, but I think it has changed since then. You have, for example, a little bit of AoE damage through Sticky Bomb. You have certain abilities that actually get extra damage against enemy PvE mobs now, and then you also have Powder Burn, which is always nice damage. So you can make this work, and the upside of this is that you have an extremely easy time pulling far away mobs. So again, in the early days when everything is very contested, there's a lot of value in that. You can also hit multiple targets at once now by shooting through them. The enemies just need to be in line, but that's another benefit. So Musket is a little bit better at the job that it used to not be able to do almost at all in comparison. I'm very torn if it's on the same level as the B tier weapons here, or more of a C tier choice. That's really up to you. I think it's more of a question of how much do you like playing the Musket playstyle, if that's your preference or not, rather than how effective it is otherwise. I don't like Musket that much, so I'm going to put it to C, but it could absolutely be argued that it's a B tier weapon at least as well. Just more of a personal preference, if anything. I wouldn't choose it for leveling, but I think it's decently effective at leveling now. The Blunderbuss is, in my opinion, not the greatest for leveling. It can be decent because it does a lot of single target damage and it does a lot of burst, and it can also do good AoE. But it's just, on one hand, you need to find the right weapon to combine it with, and then potentially need gems to make it effective, which again is annoying while leveling and possibly expensive as well. So that's a bit of a downside. And also, it doesn't come with insane inherent mobility or anything, or sustain, so you kind of blow an enemy up quickly enough or not, and if not happens, then it slows down significantly compared to some other weapons. But again, still very much a solid choice if you can combine it the right way. For example, if you go for a Great Axe Blunderbuss build, that is typically more of a PvP build, to be honest, but you can potentially combo things in a way where your cooldowns aren't too long in between, and you kind of blow up one or two mobs and then move up to the next ones, and you're almost ready to do the same thing again, possibly. But it's just not the same thing as just left-click spamming with Hatchet in comparison, so I think it is overall a little bit weaker, or like the near infinite rotations you could, for example, get on a spear. And last but not least, we have the Flail. I love the Flail, it's one of my favorite weapons in the game, but when it comes to leveling, it really isn't that great. It doesn't really do anything that other weapons don't do similarly for leveling specifically. It has some AoE damage, it has a nice amount of debuffs, but if I'm looking for debuffs and also clearing well, then the Void Blade is just way ahead of it, and if I'm otherwise looking for AoE damage in CC, then the Warhammer is kind of ahead of it. So yeah, it really also gains a lot of strength from getting some of the later perks in the trees, which takes you quite a few points to get to. So in that regard, I also don't see it as a very effective early weapon, and as such I'm going to put it into C tier here, but I don't even think it's D tier. I think even the worst quote-unquote weapon here when it comes to leveling is still a C tier weapon, because it's still good enough at leveling that you can use it effectively. Like, for example, I used it to go through the Elysian Wilds expansion with a half-leveled Flail, so it worked well enough for that still, so can't really complain. But yeah, that's the full list. Again, I'm going to make quick separate videos for the melee weapons where I explain everything about how to use it, how to combine it with other weapons, and what skill tree you want to use. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. If you want to get early tips for the expansion, some very secret stuff that I can't reveal yet, then consider supporting me on Patreon. I will make a post there right before New World Aeternum launches. And other than that, thanks to my patrons for supporting me, and thank you for watching. Sloth out.